Chapter 1. The Invitation to Harrington Hall. The snow had begun to fall in soft, persistent flakes as the train from London pulled into the little station at Much Benham. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a sensible woolen coat and a warm scarf knitted by her niece many Christmases ago, stepped carefully onto the platform. At 74, she moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had long ago learned that haste rarely improved matters. Her bright blue eyes, sharp as ever behind her spectacles, took in the winter scene with quiet pleasure. The station lamps glowing through the dusk, the muffled hush of snow on the rooftops, and the faint scent of coal smoke in the frosty air. A liveried chauffeur waited beside a gleaming black Daimler, holding a card that read Miss Marple in elegant script. He touched his cap respectfully. "Lady Harrington's car, miss. Welcome to Harrington Hall." Miss Marple smiled and allowed him to take her small suitcase. She had not expected such grandeur. After all, her old friend Evelyn Harrington, once Evelyn Pritchard, a schoolmate from long ago days in Italy, had always been unpretentious despite her title. Yet here was the car, and here was the snow, and here was Christmas approaching with all its promises and complications. The drive wound through narrow lanes banked high with snow, past hedgerows and stone walls half buried in white. At last the manor house appeared. Harrington Hall, a handsome Georgian building of pale stone, its many windows glowing warmly against the darkening sky. Holly wreaths hung on the great oak doors, and fairy lights twinkled along the portico. It looked, Miss Marple thought, exactly like the sort of place where something interesting was bound to happen. The butler who opened the door was tall and thin, with iron-grey hair and a face so expressionless it might have been carved from the same stone as the house. His black suit was immaculate, his white gloves spotless. "Miss Marple," he intoned, bowing slightly. "I am Wilkins, Lady Harrington's butler. Her ladyship is expecting you. May I take your coat?" His voice was perfectly modulated, yet something in its flat precision made Miss Marple's observant eye linger on him for a fraction longer than usual. There was a tightness about the mouth, a watchfulness in the eyes that did not quite match the polished courtesy. "Thank you, Mr. Wilkins," she said mildly, handing over her coat and scarf. He led her across the checkered marble hall, past a towering Christmas tree glittering with glass baubles and real candles. Rather daring, Miss Marple thought, but very pretty, and into a drawing-room where a log fire blazed. Lady Harrington rose from a sofa with a cry of delight. "Jane, my dear, after all these years!" Evelyn Harrington was still handsome at 76, tall and straight-backed, with silver hair elegantly coiffed. She wore a deep green velvet dress that suited the season perfectly. The two women embraced warmly, and Miss Marple was settled into a comfortable armchair with a cup of tea and a plate of tiny sandwiches almost before she could draw breath. "You are kindness itself to invite me, Evelyn," Miss Marple said. "I was expecting a quiet Christmas in St. Mary Mead." "Nonsense," Lady Harrington replied robustly. "You shall have a proper old-fashioned Christmas here, with snow and holly and far too much food. Besides, I wanted my family to meet the cleverest woman I know." Miss Marple smiled and murmured something deprecating, but her eyes were already taking quiet inventory of the room. Portraits of Harrington ancestors gazed down from panelled walls. A grand piano stood in one corner, its lid closed, and on a side table gleamed a silver tray with decanters that caught the firelight like jewels. Lady Harrington began to explain the household. My son Richard and his wife Diana are here, of course. Richard manages the estate now. My husband left everything rather run down, poor man. Then there's my granddaughter Clarissa, home from university for the holidays. And my nephew Geoffrey, he's the son of my late sister, and his friend Mr. Blake, who's staying with us. Oh, and old Colonel Bantry is coming tomorrow. You remember him, I think?" Miss Marple nodded. She remembered Colonel Bantry very well indeed. As they talked, the door opened and a young woman entered, slender, dark-haired, wearing a red dress that set off her pale skin dramatically. This, Lady Harrington explained, was Clarissa. The girl greeted Miss Marple politely, but with a certain restlessness in her manner, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. She accepted a cup of tea and perched on the edge of a chair, glancing now and then toward the window where snow continued to fall. Shortly afterward, Richard Harrington came in, a solid, fair-haired man in his 40s, with the weathered look of someone who spent much time outdoors. He shook Miss Marple's hand warmly and inquired after mutual acquaintances in St. Eunice and Mary Mead. His wife Diana followed, a striking blonde in emerald silk, whose smile was bright, but whose eyes, Miss Marple noted, rarely met one's own directly. Dinner was announced at 8. Wilkins reappeared as silently as a shadow to lead them into the dining room, where a long mahogany table was laid with damask, crystal and silver that gleamed under candlelight. The centrepiece was a magnificent arrangement of holly, ivy, and red roses. More candles flickered in wall sconces, and a second Christmas tree, this one smaller, stood in an alcove, decorated entirely in silver and white. As they took their places, Miss Marple found herself seated between Lady Harrington and Geoffrey Pritchard, the nephew. Geoffrey was a thin, nervous man of about 40, with a quick, darting smile and a habit of twisting his signet ring. He talked a great deal about London theatre and the difficulties of finding good investments these days. Opposite her sat Mr. Blake, tall, dark, impeccably dressed, with an air of quiet amusement that suggested he observed more than he revealed. Throughout the excellent meal, clear soup, roast goose with all the traditional trimmings, and a flaming Christmas pudding, Miss Marple listened and watched. She noticed how Diana Harrington's laughter was a little too loud when her husband spoke, how Clarissa barely touched her food, how Geoffrey drank rather more wine than was perhaps wise. And she noticed Wilkins. The butler moved around the table with perfect efficiency, yet twice she caught him pausing, just for a fraction of a second, when certain names were mentioned. Once when Richard spoke of the estate's financial difficulties, and again when Diana laughed about family heirlooms gathering dust. Each time Wilkins's face remained impassive, but his hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the decanter he was holding. After dinner, the party moved back to the drawing-room for coffee and brandy. Clarissa played carols on the piano with more enthusiasm than skill, and Geoffrey told an interminable story about a pantomime he had seen in town. Outside, the snow fell thicker than ever, blanketing the world in silence. At length, Lady Harrington suggested that her old friend might like an early night after the journey. Wilkins appeared as if summoned by thought alone to light Miss Marple's way upstairs. Her bedroom was charming. Rose-patterned chintz, a fire burning low in the grate, and a view over snow-covered gardens glimmering in moonlight. As Wilkins set down her suitcase and inquired whether she required anything else, Miss Marple studied him thoughtfully. "You have a very beautiful house here, Mr. Wilkins," she said pleasantly. "How long have you been with Lady Harrington?" 23 years, miss," he replied, his tone giving nothing away. "That is a long time. You must know the family very well indeed." A flicker, barely perceptible, crossed his face. "One learns to be discreet in service, miss." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Discretion is everything." When he had gone, she sat for a while by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. She was thinking about discretion, and about butlers who had been in service for 23 years, and about the faint but unmistakable tension she had sensed running beneath the polished surface of Harrington Hall like a hidden current. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent and deep. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. Miss Marple had a feeling it would be a most interesting Christmas. Chapter 2. The Yuletide Gathering. Christmas Eve dawned bright and cold, the snow lying thick upon the lawns of Harrington Hall like a crisp white counterpane. Miss Marple woke early, as was her habit, and drew back the chintz curtains to watch the pale winter sun glinting on the frozen lake beyond the rose garden. A robin hopped along the window-sill, cocking its head at her with bright inquisitive eyes. She smiled, dressed in a warm tweed skirt and a soft blue cardigan, and went downstairs in search of breakfast. The breakfast room overlooked the south terrace, and a small fire crackled cheerfully in the grate. Only Lady Harrington and Richard were there when Miss Marple entered. Richard rose politely, wished her good morning, and returned to his newspaper. Lady Harrington, buttering toast with vigour, pressed a plate of kippers upon her guest. "You must fortify yourself, Jane. We have a full day ahead. Church at 11, then luncheon, and tonight our proper Christmas Eve dinner. The Colonel arrives this afternoon, and Geoffrey's friend Mr. Blake is already prowling about the library." Miss Marple accepted a kipper and a cup of strong tea. She inquired gently after the health of the household, and Lady Harrington, never one to mince words, admitted that Clarissa had been rather moody of late. "University does that to young people, I suppose," she said. "All those ideas. And Diana complains of headaches, though I suspect it's more to do with the estate accounts than anything else. Richard worries too much." Richard grunted from behind his newspaper, but did not contradict her. After breakfast, Miss Marple took a short turn about the snowy gardens, admiring the yew hedges clipped into fantastic shapes, and the ice-bound fountain where stone dolphins spouted frozen spray. She noticed footprints leading from a side door toward the stables, small, neat prints that might have belonged to a woman, and a single set of larger, heavier prints that crossed them and returned toward the house. Interesting, she thought, but perhaps no more than a maid taking a message. At 11, the household assembled in the hall for church. Wilkins handed out coats and mufflers with his customary silent efficiency. Miss Marple observed that he avoided looking directly at Clarissa when he helped her into a fur-trimmed cloak, and that Clarissa herself seemed unusually pale beneath her rouge. The little Norman church in the village was crowded with tenants and villagers, and the service was simple and heartfelt. Carols sung lustily, the familiar lessons read by the vicar in his rich country voice. Miss Marple enjoyed it all immensely, though she noticed Diana Harrington fidgeting throughout, and Geoffrey whispering to Mr. Blake behind a hymn sheet. Back at the hall, hot soup and cold game pie awaited them. Colonel Bantry arrived just as they were finishing luncheon. A bluff, red-faced man with a booming voice and a fondness for military anecdotes. He greeted Miss Marple with delight. "By Jove, Miss Marple, didn't expect to find you here. Solving any murders, eh?" "Not yet, Colonel," she replied mildly, and he roared with laughter as though she had made the best joke in the world. The afternoon passed in pleasant idleness. Clarissa disappeared upstairs, pleading letters to write. Diana retired with one of her headaches. Richard and the Colonel went off to inspect a new drainage scheme on the home farm. Geoffrey and Mr. Blake played billiards. Lady Harrington dozed by the drawing-room fire, and Miss Marple, with a piece of fancy knitting in her lap, sat quietly observing the comings and goings of the servants through the half-open door. Wilkins passed several times, carrying trays or messages. Once he paused in the corridor to speak in low tones to a young housemaid, who blushed and hurried away. Another time he stood motionless for several moments outside the library door, as though listening. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, but her mind was busy. At 5 o'clock, the party gathered again in the drawing-room for tea. The great Christmas tree had been lit, dozens of real candles flickering among the branches, and the room looked magical. Trays of scones, crumpets, and mince pies were brought in, and Wilkins poured sherry with solemn precision. Conversation turned, as it always does at Christmas, to old times. Lady Harrington spoke of house parties long ago, when her husband was alive and the estate prosperous. Richard listened with a tight smile. Geoffrey reminisced about childhood visits and games of hide-and-seek in the attics. Clarissa said almost nothing. Mr. Blake, the quiet, dark stranger, suddenly asked Lady Harrington about the family jewels. "I believe you have some famous pieces, ma'am. The emerald brooch, for instance?" Lady Harrington laughed. "Oh yes, the Harrington emerald. Rather vulgarly large, but it has been in the family since George III's time. I wear it on special occasions. It's in my dressing-room safe at this moment." Miss Marple noticed that Wilkins, refilling the sherry decanter, paused almost imperceptibly at these words. After tea, the younger members dispersed, Clarissa to change for dinner, Geoffrey and Blake to finish their game. The Colonel challenged Richard to chess. Lady Harrington suggested that Miss Marple might like to see the conservatory, where forced hyacinths were already in bloom. They wandered through the glass doors into a warm, fragrant world of palms and flowering plants. Snow pressed white against the panes above their heads, making the place feel like a magical cave. Lady Harrington spoke affectionately of her late husband and the happy Christmases they had known. "But things change, Jane," she said with a sigh. "Money is tight. Richard does his best, but death duties and repairs. And young people today want so much." Miss Marple murmured sympathy. She was thinking how often money, or the lack of it, lay at the root of human unhappiness. Dinner that evening was a splendid affair. The table glittered with crystal and old silver. Candles in tall epergnes threw soft light on damask and holly. Wilkins had excelled himself. Clear turtle soup, turbot with lobster sauce, roast turkey with chestnut stuffing, and a blazing plum pudding carried in to rapturous applause. After the ladies withdrew, the men lingered over port and cigars. In the drawing-room, Diana played the piano creditably, some Chopin nocturnes, and Clarissa sang a modern carol in a clear, slightly husky voice that made Miss Marple think of nightingales and hidden sorrow. When the men rejoined them, coffee was served, and the party gathered around the great fireplace. Logs crackled and sparked. Outside, the wind had risen, and snow tapped softly against the windows. Geoffrey proposed that they tell ghost stories, as in the old tradition. The Colonel obliged with a blood-curdling tale of a haunted bunker in Mesopotamia. Mr. Blake told a chilling little anecdote about a house in Prague where mirrors showed things that were not there. Clarissa refused to contribute, saying such things frightened her. At length, Lady Harrington declared it was time for the tree. Presents had been placed beneath it during the day, wrapped in coloured paper and ribbon. There was much laughter as parcels were distributed. Books, handkerchiefs, scarves, a pipe for the Colonel, a pretty enamelled box for Diana from her husband. Miss Marple received a soft Shetland shawl from Lady Harrington, and a box of homemade Turkish delight from Clarissa. She was touched, and said so. Wilkins moved quietly about the room, replenishing the fire and removing empty cups. At one point he passed close behind Clarissa's chair, and Miss Marple distinctly saw the girl flinch, as though his shadow had touched her. Midnight approached. The Colonel proposed a toast to absent friends. Glasses were raised, and for a moment the room was filled with warmth and goodwill. Then Lady Harrington suggested they all go to bed, for there would be stockings to fill and early service on Christmas morning. As the party broke up, Miss Marple lingered a moment by the tree, admiring the candles. Wilkins was extinguishing them one by one with a long silver snuffer. Their eyes met briefly. "A very happy Christmas to you, Mr. Wilkins," she said gently. "And to you, miss," he replied, his voice as expressionless as ever. Yet Miss Marple, going upstairs a few minutes later, found herself thinking about that exchange. There had been something in the butler's eyes, a wariness, almost a plea, that did not quite match his perfect manners. She paused on the landing, looking down into the hall below. The great tree stood dark now, its candles gone. Snow whirled against the tall windows. Somewhere in the house a door closed softly. Miss Marple continued to her room, but she did not immediately undress. Instead, she sat by her dying fire, her mind turning over the events of the day like pieces of a half-formed jigsaw. So many small things. Clarissa's pallor, Diana's headaches, Geoffrey's restlessness, the footprints in the snow, Wilkins's listening attitude outside the library door. Human nature, she reflected, was very much the same everywhere, whether in a village like St. Mary Mead or a great house like Harrington Hall. People concealed things, fears, desires, secrets. And at Christmas, when emotions ran high and old memories stirred, those concealments sometimes grew thin. She thought of the emerald brooch, safely locked away, or so Lady Harrington believed. Miss Marple sighed, picked up her knitting, and began another row of delicate lace pattern. Outside, the wind moaned in the chimneys, and the snow continued to fall. Chapter 3. The Missing Emerald Brooch. Christmas morning broke clear and still, the snow sparkling under a pale blue sky, as though the world had been newly polished for the occasion. Church bells from the village drifted across the frozen park, calling the household to early service. Miss Marple, already dressed in her neat grey coat and small velvet hat, paused at her bedroom window to watch the family assemble in the hall below. Lady Harrington was radiant in a fur-trimmed cloak, a single diamond pin at her throat. Richard helped her tenderly, while Diana, elegant in sable, stood a little apart, tapping one gloved hand impatiently against her muff. Clarissa appeared last, pale and heavy-eyed, wrapped in a scarlet coat that made her look younger than her 20 years. Geoffrey and Mr. Blake brought up the rear, talking in low voices. Colonel Bantry's hearty laugh echoed as he clapped Richard on the shoulder. Wilkins stood by the open door, impassive as ever, handing out prayer books, and wishing each member of the party a reverent happy Christmas. Miss Marple noticed that when Clarissa passed him, the butler's eyes followed her for a moment longer than courtesy required. The short service was beautiful. Children's voices raised in Once in Royal David City, the crib glowing with candles, the scent of pine and incense thick in the frosty air. Afterward, the family distributed small gifts to the villagers, baskets of food, toys for the children, coins for the old. Lady Harrington moved among her tenants with gracious kindness, and Miss Marple thought how pleasant it was to see tradition kept alive. Back at the hall, the great hall smelled wonderfully of roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. Stockings had been filled during the night. Small tokens, sweets, oranges, a silver sixpence, and there was much laughter as they were opened before luncheon. Miss Marple received a pretty lavender sachets from the housemaids and a tiny booklet of Devonshire recipes from Lady Harrington. Luncheon itself was a cheerful meal: cold roast beef, hot raised pie, celery in cream, and a towering trifle. Champagne flowed, toasts were drunk to the king and to absent friends. Clarissa alone seemed subdued, pushing food about her plate and answering in monosyllables when spoken to. After the meal, the party dispersed. Richard and the Colonel went to smoke cigars in the library. Geoffrey and Mr. Blake disappeared toward the billiard room. Diana declared her intention of resting before tea. Clarissa slipped away upstairs without a word. Lady Harrington turned to Miss Marple with a smile. "Now, Jane, I want to show you something special. Come up with me." They climbed the wide staircase together, past ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow them. On the first-floor landing, Lady Harrington led the way along a carpeted corridor to her private sitting room, a charming apartment overlooking the snow-covered rose garden. A small fire burned in the grate, and on a table stood a photograph of a much younger Evelyn with her late husband. But it was not the photograph she wished to show. She crossed to an elegant walnut bureau, unlocked a drawer, and drew out a leather jewel case. "I thought you might like to see the famous emerald," she said, opening the lid with a little flourish. The case was lined with faded blue velvet. In the centre lay an indentation shaped for a brooch, but the velvet was bare. Lady Harrington stared for a moment in simple astonishment. "It's gone," she said blankly. Miss Marple stepped closer. The empty indentation was clearly visible. A few threads of green silk caught the light, but the great square emerald surrounded by diamonds that should have rested, there was missing. Lady Harrington recovered herself quickly. "How very odd. I distinctly remember locking it away last night after dinner. I always keep the key on my chatelaine." She touched the small bunch of keys at her waist. "Perhaps you wore it yesterday and forgot," Miss Marple suggested gently. No, I wore only the diamond pin to church this morning. And last night I showed it to Diana. She admired it very much, and then I put it away myself." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the empty case. There were no signs of forcible entry. The lock on the drawer was undamaged. Whoever had taken the brooch had used a key, or had known where one was kept. Lady Harrington rang the bell. After a moment, Wilkins appeared, silent and correct. "Wilkins, has anyone been in my sitting-room this morning?" "Not to my knowledge, my lady. The maids dusted early before church, but I supervised them myself." "And the drawer was locked then?" "I could not say, my lady. I did not notice." Lady Harrington hesitated, then said firmly, "The emerald brooch has disappeared from its case. I wish you to inform the household quietly. No fuss. but everyone must be asked if they have seen it. Wilkins inclined his head. "Very good, my lady." For the briefest instant, his eyes flicked toward Miss Marple, then away again. When he had gone, Lady Harrington sat down, rather suddenly. "It is insured, of course, but that is not the point. The brooch has been in the family for generations. I intended it for Clarissa eventually." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand comfortingly. "These things often turn up in the most unexpected places. Perhaps it was mislaid during cleaning." But privately she doubted it. The indentation in the velvet was clean and undisturbed. No careless maid had simply moved it aside while dusting. They went downstairs together. In the drawing-room, the atmosphere had subtly changed. Richard looked grave. Diana's bright manner seemed forced. Clarissa sat by the window, staring out at the snow, her face white. Wilkins moved among them, speaking quietly to each person in turn. Miss Marple watched closely. When the butler approached Clarissa, the girl turned on him almost fiercely. "I haven't seen it. Why should I have seen it?" "No one is suggesting anything, miss," Wilkins replied in his level voice. "Her ladyship merely wishes to know if anyone noticed the brooch this morning." Clarissa jumped up. "I was in my room until church. Ask anyone." She hurried from the room. A moment later they heard her footsteps running upstairs. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Deuced awkward, what? Probably turn up in a sofa cushion or some such place." But no one looked convinced. Tea was a strained affair. Conversation limped along on safe topics. The weather, the King's broadcast, plans for Boxing Day. Miss Marple drank her tea and observed. She noticed that Geoffrey kept twisting his signet ring faster than ever. That Diana's hand trembled slightly as she passed the cake. That Mr. Blake's dark eyes moved thoughtfully from face to face. And that Wilkins, serving silently, seemed more than usually watchful. After tea, Lady Harrington suggested a search of the upstairs rooms. Richard proposed calling the police, but his mother vetoed the idea firmly. "Not yet. It may still be a silly mistake. We will search thoroughly first." The household dispersed. Maids were sent to look in unlikely corners. Richard and the Colonel examined the sitting-room drawer for signs of tampering and found none. Diana and Clarissa, reluctantly, searched each other's bedrooms under Lady Harrington's supervision. Miss Marple, left to her own devices, took a quiet turn about the ground floor. She examined the Christmas tree again, running her fingers lightly over the lower branches. She looked behind cushions in the drawing-room and morning-room. She even peered into the grand piano. Nothing. At 6 o'clock they gathered again, weary and discouraged. No trace of the brooch had been found. Lady Harrington sighed. "I'm afraid we must accept that it has been stolen. Wilkins, telephone the local police in the morning, discreetly mind." "Very good, my lady." Dinner that evening was subdued. The candles still flickered, the silver still gleamed, but the laughter of the previous night was gone. Clarissa barely spoke. Geoffrey drank steadily. Even the Colonel's anecdotes fell flat. After dinner the ladies withdrew early. In the drawing-room Diana played a few restless chords on the piano and then stopped abruptly. "I have a headache," she announced. "I think I shall go to bed." Clarissa followed soon after. Lady Harrington and Miss Marple sat alone by the fire. "This is very disturbing, Jane," Lady Harrington said quietly. "One likes to think one's home is safe, especially at Christmas." Miss Marple nodded. "It is disturbing, but often these matters have simple explanations once all of the facts are known." Her mind was busy. She was thinking about keys, how many there were, who might have access to duplicates. She was thinking about motives, money, jealousy, revenge. And she was thinking about Wilkins's calm statement that he had supervised the maids that morning, and wondering why Clarissa had reacted so strongly to a perfectly ordinary question. Upstairs, as she prepared for bed, Miss Marple heard muffled voices in the corridor. Clarissa's, raised and angry, and then a lower murmur that might have been Diana's. A door slammed. She sat by her fire for a long time, knitting slowly, her thoughts turning over the events of the day like pebbles in a stream. Somewhere in Harrington Hall, someone knew where the emerald brooch was hidden. Someone had planned this carefully. And someone, perhaps the same person, was very much afraid. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and silent, covering all traces. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Servants' Quarters. Boxing Day morning brought a thaw. Water dripped steadily from the eaves of Harrington Hall, and the snow on the lawns began to sag into grey slush. The bright Christmas mood had quite vanished. The theft of the emerald brooch hung over the house like a pall. The local police had been telephoned, and a detective inspector was expected after luncheon. In the meantime, an uneasy restraint governed every conversation. Miss Marple, who believed that much could be learned from those who served as well as those who were served, decided that the time had come for a visit below stairs. She had always found that servants saw more than their employers supposed, and often understood it better. After breakfast, she slipped quietly into the kitchens on the pretext of thanking the cook for the excellent Christmas dinner. Mrs. Hardcastle, a plump, red-cheeked woman who had ruled the Harrington stoves for 30 years, was delighted to receive praise and immediately pressed upon Miss Marple a cup of strong tea and a slice of seed cake. "Such a dreadful thing about her ladyship's brooch, miss," Mrs. Hardcastle said, lowering her voice though no one else was near. "We're all proper upset. Wilkins says we're to be extra careful what we say, with the police coming." Miss Marple sipped her tea and murmured sympathy. Mr. Wilkins must feel it deeply, having been in service here so long. Mrs. Hardcastle snorted. "Long? Aye, 23 years come Lady Day. But there's some as think he's been too long, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple's bright eyes encouraged her to continue. "Well, miss, it's not for me to gossip," the cook said, proceeding immediately to do so. "But Wilkins came here after some trouble in his last place. Something about missing silver. Never proved, mind, but the family let him go all the same." His references were from further back. Her ladyship took him on because he'd been with Lord Ashbury once, and she knew the family. "But there's always been talk. Talk of what kind, Mrs. Hardcastle?" The cook glanced over her shoulder. "That he bears a grudge. Old Lord Harrington, Sir Gerald that was, sacked Wilkins's father years ago, when Wilkins was only a footman elsewhere. Something about poaching on estate land. The father drank himself to death afterward, they say. Wilkins never forgot it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Grudges, she knew, could lie dormant for decades, and then burst into flame at the most unexpected moment. A young housemaid named Elsie entered just then, carrying empty trays. She bobbed a curtsy to Miss Marple and began stacking plates. "And what do you think, Elsie?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Have you noticed anything unusual these past days?" Elsie coloured. "I couldn't say, miss. Only, well, I did see Miss Clarissa in the corridor outside her ladyship's sitting room yesterday morning, early, before church. She looked ever so upset, like she'd been crying." Mrs. Hardcastle clicked her tongue. That poor child has been unhappy for weeks. University friends, I dare say, modern ideas and all that." But Miss Marple filed the information away. She lingered a little longer, admiring the gleaming copper pans and asking innocent questions that drew out more whispers. She learned that Geoffrey Pritchard owed money in town and had been pressing his aunt for a loan, that Diana Harrington had expensive taste and had been heard quarrelling with her husband about bills, that Mr. Blake, the quiet guest, had arrived with only one small suitcase, but seemed to know a great deal about valuable jewellery. And she learned something else. Wilkins, it seemed, had a duplicate key to most rooms in the house, including Lady Harrington's sitting-room drawer. "Master key, he calls it," Mrs. Hardcastle said darkly. "For emergencies, he says, but some of us wonder." Miss Marple thanked them warmly and returned upstairs, her mind busy. Luncheon was a stiff meal. Detective Inspector Slack, a brisk, sandy-haired man with a disconcerting habit of barking questions, arrived halfway through the sweets. He interviewed Lady Harrington first in the library, then Richard, then each guest in turn. Wilkins hovered in the background, ready with papers or refreshments as required. Miss Marple, not yet summoned, sat in the morning room with her knitting. Through the half-open door, she could see the inspector emerging from the library with Richard. Slack's voice was audible. "No sign of forced entry. Must have been someone with access to a key. We'll need fingerprints, sir, on the drawer and the jewel case." Richard looked harassed. "Of course, Inspector. Anything we can do." The afternoon wore on. Miss Marple took another quiet stroll, this time to the servants' hall. She found Elsie alone, polishing silver. "Tell me, Elsie," she said softly, "did you notice anything else unusual on Christmas morning?" The girl hesitated, then whispered, "Only that Mr. Wilkins was in a rare taking when he found the brooch gone. He went quite white, and his hand shook when he poured her ladyship's tea. I've never seen him like that before." Miss Marple thanked her and moved on. Tea was served early. The inspector joined them, accepting a cup with grudging courtesy. He announced that no fingerprints other than Lady Harrington's had been found on the drawer or case. Everything had been carefully wiped. "Points to premeditation," he said grimly. "Someone who knew what they were doing." Clarissa, who had been silent throughout, suddenly pushed back her chair and left the room. Diana followed a moment later. After tea, Miss Marple suggested a breath of air. She persuaded Clarissa, who looked pale and strained, to accompany her for a short walk in the dripping gardens. They paced slowly along the terrace, the girl's arm linked unwillingly through Miss Marple's. "My dear," Miss Marple said at last, "you are carrying a heavy burden. Would it not be wiser to share it?" Clarissa stopped dead. "I don't know what you mean. I think you do. You were seen near your grandmother's sitting room on Christmas morning. And you have been deeply unhappy." Tears welled in the girl's eyes. "It's nothing to do with the brooch. I swear it. Then what is it to do with?" Clarissa looked away, across the sodden lawns. "I can't tell you. I promised. Promises made under duress are not always binding," Miss Marple said gently. The girl shook her head violently and hurried back into the house. Dinner that evening was the most uncomfortable yet. Inspector Slack had departed to pursue inquiries in the village, promising to return in the morning. Conversation limped. Geoffrey drank too much claret. Colonel Bantry tried valiantly to keep things going with hunting stories, but even he flagged. After the ladies withdrew, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, ostensibly admiring a portrait. she heard raised voices from the library. Richard and Diana, arguing fiercely about money. Then silence. In the drawing room, Lady Harrington sat with compressed lips, working at her embroidery as though stabbing an enemy. Clarissa was absent. At 10 o'clock, a scream rang through the house, high, terrified, unmistakably Clarissa's. Miss Marple was first on the scene. She found the girl at the top of the back stairs, staring down into the dimly lit passage below. At the foot of the stairs lay Wilkins motionless, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath him. Blood from a gash on his forehead darkened the stone flags. Richard and Geoffrey arrived moments later, followed by the rest of the household. He fell, Clarissa stammered. I came down to get a book, and I saw him lying there. Richard knelt beside the butler. He's alive, thank God. Concussion, perhaps a broken arm. Ring for Dr. Haynes at once. Servants scurried. Wilkins was carried to his room. Dr. Haynes arrived within the hour, pronounced a severe concussion and a fractured wrist, and ordered complete rest. Slipped on the stairs, most likely, the doctor said. They're worn and polished, treacherous in dim light. But Miss Marple, standing quietly in the background, noticed two things. First, that the back stairs were well lit by a wall bracket that had been switched on. Clarissa herself must have turned it on as she descended. Second, that one of the brass stair rods was slightly loosened, as though it had been tampered with. She said nothing, but her mild blue eyes were very thoughtful. Later, in her bedroom, she sat by the fire, long after the house had settled into uneasy quiet. An attempted theft. Successful. An accident to the butler who might know too much. A young girl terrified into silence. The pattern was beginning to emerge. Somewhere in the darkness outside, a fox barked sharply. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, but her fingers were still. Human nature, she reflected, was seldom original, but it was always dangerous when cornered. Tomorrow, she thought, would be revealing. Chapter 5. The Midnight Confession. The thaw continued through the evening, turning the snow into a sodden blanket that muffled every sound outside Harrington Hall. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. Wilkins lay in his room under the doctor's care, sedated with laudanum, his forehead bandaged and his fractured wrist set in splints. A temporary butler, a nervous young footman named Thomas, stumbled through the dinner service, spilling gravy and forgetting the wine. No one complained. Appetites were poor. Miss Marple observed it all with her usual quiet attention. Clarissa had not appeared at dinner, pleading a headache. Diana picked at her food, her usual poise cracked by dark circles under her eyes. Geoffrey nursed a brandy in the corner, his signet ring clicking incessantly against the glass. Mr. Blake sat silently, his dark gaze unreadable. Richard and Colonel Bantry discussed estate matters in low tones, while Lady Harrington, ever the stoic hostess, tried to keep conversation alive with reminiscences of past Boxing Days. After dinner, the party fragmented early. The Colonel retired to the library with a book on military history. Geoffrey and Blake played a desultory game of cards. Diana excused herself to check on Clarissa. Lady Harrington asked Miss Marple to join her in the conservatory for a quiet cup of cocoa. The glass house was warm and dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming camellias. Snowmelt dripped from the panes overhead, pattering like rain. "I fear this Christmas has been ruined, Jane," Lady Harrington said wearily, stirring her cocoa. "First the brooch, now poor Wilkins, and Clarissa. She is not herself at all." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand. Troubles often come in clusters, my dear, but they pass. Tell me, have you noticed anything particular about Clarissa's mood these past weeks?" Lady Harrington sighed. She has been distant since returning from university. Letters arrive that upset her. I've seen her crying over them. And she argues with Diana about the silliest things. Young people, I suppose. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. University friends, modern ideas. Mrs. Hardcastle had said much the same. But there was more to it. She felt certain. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the drip of water and the occasional creak of the old house settling. At length, Lady Harrington yawned delicately. "I think I shall retire. Will you be long, Jane?" "Not long," Miss Marple assured her. "The warmth here is soothing after such a day." Alone, she wandered among the potted plants, her mind turning over the fragments she had gathered. The loosened stair rod, Wilkins's grudge, Clarissa's early morning tears outside the sitting room, the wiped fingerprints on the jewel case. And now this accident that was no accident. Someone had meant to silence the butler, or at least to warn him. A storm was brewing outside. The wind had risen, rattling the glass panes and howling in the chimneys. Thunder rumbled distantly over the downs. Miss Marple decided to return to her room. As she passed through the dimly lit corridor toward the main staircase, a door opened softly ahead. It was Clarissa's room. The girl emerged, wrapped in a dressing gown, her hair loose about her shoulders. She started at the sight of Miss Marple. "Oh, it's you. I couldn't sleep. The storm—" "Nor I," Miss Marple said gently. "Shall we go down to the drawing-room? A little company might help." Clarissa hesitated, then nodded. They descended the stairs together, the wind moaning louder now, rain lashing the windows in sudden gusts. The drawing-room fire had been banked for the night, but still gave off a cheerful glow. Miss Marple poked it into life and added a log. Clarissa curled up in an armchair, hugging her knees. For a time they sat in silence, watching the flames. Lightning flickered, illuminating the room in brief, stark flashes. Thunder followed, closer now. At last Clarissa spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have to tell someone. It's eating me up inside." Miss Marple said nothing, merely waiting with that patient encouragement she had perfected over years of village confidences. "It started last summer," Clarissa began, her words tumbling out. "At university, there was a man, older, charming. He said he loved me, promised we'd marry once I finished my studies. But he was already married, though he lied about it. When I found out, I broke it off. But then I discovered I was going to have a baby." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her heart ached for the girl. "I couldn't tell grandmother. She'd be heartbroken. And Richard, he's so proper. I wrote to the man begging for help. He sent money for an arrangement, but I couldn't go through with it. The baby was born in October, in a little nursing home in London. I gave it up for adoption. The papers were signed. It's final." Tears streamed down her face now. "But the letters keep coming. He wants more money to keep quiet, or he'll tell the family. And Diana, she knows. She overheard me on the telephone and has been threatening to expose me unless I help her." "Help her how?" Miss Marple asked softly. "With the brooch. She said if I took it and gave it to her, she'd destroy the letters she has, copies of mine to him. She needs money desperately. Richard has cut her allowance because of her debts. she planned it all. I'd take the brooch on Christmas morning while everyone was at church, hide it in her room, and she'd sell it through Mr. Blake. He knows dealers in London. Miss Marple leaned forward. "And did you take it?" Clarissa shook her head violently. "No. I went to grandmother's room that morning to confess everything, to beg for the brooch as a way to pay him off myself. But when I opened the drawer, it was already gone. Someone had taken it before me." Lightning crashed overhead, and the lights flickered. Clarissa buried her face in her hands. "There's more," she whispered. "Wilkins, he saw me in the corridor. He suspected. This evening before his fall, he cornered me in the servants' stairs. He said he knew about the baby, that he'd seen letters addressed to me in London when he forwarded the post. He wanted money too, or he'd tell grandmother. We argued. I pushed past him, and then he slipped. Oh God, did I cause it?" Miss Marple considered. The loosened stair rod suggested otherwise, but fear could distort memory. "You did not cause his fall, my dear. Someone else loosened that rod. Likely the same person who took the brooch and wiped the prints." "Diana?" Clarissa asked tremulously. "Or an accomplice? Tell me about Mr. Blake. He's Diana's friend, really. They met in town. He's always talking about antiques, jewels. Diana says he's helped her sell things before, small pieces from the house that Richard wouldn't miss." The storm raged on, rain hammering the windows like impatient fists. Miss Marple rose and poured Clarissa a small glass of brandy from the decanter. "Drink this. You have been very brave to tell me. Now, the letters. Where are they?" "Diana has them locked in her jewel case. She showed me. And the man, his name? Harold Fielding. He lives in Kensington." Miss Marple nodded. "Tomorrow we will deal with this properly. But first, you must promise me something. No more secrets, no more running away. Truth is always the kinder path in the end." Clarissa managed a watery smile. "You believe me? I believe you are a young woman who made a mistake and has suffered for it. Many have done the same." They talked a little longer. About the adoption agency, the nursing home, the need for a lawyer to handle Mr. Fielding. Miss Marple promised discretion and help. At midnight, the storm began to ease, the thunder rolling away into the distance. Clarissa, exhausted from her confession, allowed Miss Marple to escort her back to bed. In her own room, Miss Marple did not immediately retire. She sat by the window, watching the rain subside into a steady drizzle. The pieces were falling into place. Diana's desperation for money, Blake's expertise, Clarissa's intended role as scapegoat. The brooch taken early, before Clarissa's attempt. Wilkins's blackmail attempt, born of his old grudge perhaps or simple opportunism. But who had loosened the stair rod? Diana, to silence Wilkins before he exposed her. Or Blake, protecting their scheme. And where was the brooch now? Miss Marple picked up her knitting, but her mind was far from the delicate lace pattern. Financial woes, hidden affairs, a secret baby, these were the stuff of village scandals in St. Mary Mead, writ large in a country house. She thought of Wilkins lying bandaged below stairs, his lie perhaps not yet fully told. Butlers, she reflected, were privy to many secrets, and secrets like storms could break suddenly. Tomorrow, with Inspector Slack returning, the pressure would mount. Miss Marple intended to be ready. She blew out her candle at last. The house was quiet but for the drip of water from the eaves and the occasional creak of old timbers. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of emerald brooches glinting in candlelight and shadows moving on staircases. Chapter 6. Clues by the Christmas Tree. The morning after the storm dawned grey and drizzly, with low clouds pressing down on Harrington Hall like a damp lid. Water dripped from every gutter and eave, and the once pristine snow had turned to a dirty slush that soaked through shoes and chilled the bone. Inspector Slack arrived early, his mackintosh dripping on the marble floor as he demanded fresh interviews. Miss Marple, however, had her own investigations to pursue. She believed that the answers often lay in the smallest details, the things people overlooked precisely because they were so familiar. And so, while the household gathered uneasily in the morning room, awaiting the inspector's pleasure, she slipped away to the great hall where the Christmas tree still stood in solitary splendour. The candles had long since been removed, but the tree remained decorated. Glass baubles, tinsel, paper chains made by Clarissa in childhood, and a fairy doll perched crookedly at the top. Presents had been cleared away, but a few stray ribbons and tags lay forgotten on the turkey carpet beneath. Miss Marple began at the bottom, circling the tree slowly, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. She examined the lower branches, running gloved fingers lightly over needles and ornaments. Halfway round, she paused. Caught on a twig near the back, almost hidden by thicker foliage, was a single green thread, finer than sewing cotton, with a tiny gleam of gold at one end. She detached it carefully. It was silk, torn from embroidery, or perhaps from the lining of the jewel case itself. Someone had brushed past the tree in haste, carrying the brooch wrapped in cloth or concealed in a pocket. Encouraged, she continued her search. On the floor, half buried under a fallen pine needle, lay a small brass screw. She picked it up and turned it over thoughtfully. It was newish, not tarnished, and identical to those securing the stair rods on the back staircase. She pocketed both items and moved to the French windows that opened onto the terrace. They had been locked since Christmas Eve, but she noticed faint scratches around the keyhole, recent bright metal showing through the old brass. Someone had used a duplicate key, or perhaps a picklock. Outside, the terrace flags were wet and muddy. Most footprints had been washed away by the overnight rain, but near the balustrade, protected by the overhanging roof, she found what she sought. A clear set of small, narrow shoe prints, leading from the window to the stone steps that descended to the rose garden. Beside them, deeper and larger, were a man's prints, pointed brogues, she thought, like those worn by Mr. Blake. The woman's prints, she judged them to be Diana's, from the fashionable narrow heel, returned alone. The man's did not. Miss Marple followed them down the steps. At the bottom, where the path branched toward the old summer house, she found a crumpled cigarette stub. Turkish, gold-tipped, the kind Mr. Blake favoured. Diana smoked only expensive Egyptians. She straightened, her mind racing. The brooch had been taken from the sitting room early on Christmas morning, concealed, and brought down here during the confusion of present opening, or perhaps later, when the party gathered round the tree. Then, under cover of darkness or the storm, passed to Blake for hiding or removal. But where was it now? Returning indoors, she sought out Mrs. Hardcastle in the kitchen. "Tell me," she asked pleasantly, "has anything been burned in the boiler lately? Papers, cloth, anything unusual?" The cook looked surprised. "Why, yes, miss. Yesterday afternoon, during all the upset about Mr. Wilkins, Thomas the footman took a bundle down. Said it was rubbish from the guests' rooms. Mostly torn wrapping paper. But I thought I smelled velvet burning. Funny that." Velvet. The jewel case had been lined with blue velvet. Miss Marple thanked her and went in search of Clarissa. She found the girl in the conservatory, pale but composed, watering plants with unnecessary concentration. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "I need your help. Can you tell me exactly where Diana keeps her jewel case?" "In the top drawer of her dressing table, locked. She showed me once. Boasted about it, really." "And does she ever leave her room unlocked?" "Sometimes when she goes down to breakfast early. She thinks no one would dare enter." Miss Marple nodded. "One more thing. The summer house. Do you know if it has a loose floorboard or hiding place?" Clarissa's eyes widened. "Yes, under the old chaise longue. Grandfather used to keep brandy there during prohibition parties. Everyone knows, but it's been forgotten lately." "Thank you, my dear. Now stay here and say nothing to anyone." Inspector Slack was still occupied with Richard in the library. Miss Marple slipped upstairs to the family wing. Diana's room was empty, the bed made, a faint scent of expensive perfume lingering. The dressing-table drawer was locked, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that many locks were more ornamental than secure. A sturdy hairpin and a little patience sufficed. Inside the drawer, beneath scarves and gloves, lay Diana's jewel case, smaller than Lady Harrington's, modern Morocco leather. It was locked too, but again the hairpin served. Inside were a few modest rings and brooches, a string of pearls, and a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. Miss Marple glanced at the top one. It was addressed to Clarissa in a bold masculine hand, postmarked Kensington. She left them undisturbed but memorized the address. Then she relocked everything carefully and went downstairs. Luncheon was a silent meal. Wilkins, though still confined to bed, had regained consciousness and given a statement to the inspector. He remembered arguing with someone on the back stairs, could not say whom, then a push, a fall, darkness. Slack was inclined to treat it as accident, but Miss Marple noted the gleam of suspicion in his eye. After luncheon, while rain continued to fall, Miss Marple persuaded Colonel Bantry to accompany her on a constitutional to the summer house. The Colonel, glad of distraction, agreed readily. The little octagonal building stood forlorn among sodden rose bushes, its paint peeling. Inside it smelled of damp and leaf mould. The chaise longue, faded green velvet, stood against one wall. "Jolly place in summer," the Colonel boomed. "Used to have tea here with Lady H's mother." Miss Marple murmured agreement while lifting the cushion. Beneath it, one floorboard was slightly raised. She pressed, and it lifted easily. In the cavity below lay a soft chamois leather bag. She opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in a silk handkerchief, gleamed the Harrington emerald, square-cut, flawless, surrounded by brilliant diamonds. It caught what little light there was, and threw it back in green fire. "Well, I'll be dashed," muttered the Colonel. Miss Marple replaced it exactly as found and lowered the board. "We will say nothing yet," she said quietly. "But perhaps you might keep an eye on Mr. Blake this afternoon, Colonel. I fancy he may become restless." They returned to the house separately. Miss Marple went straight to the drawing-room, where most of the party had gathered round the fire. Diana was embroidering with quick, nervous stitches. Blake stood at the window staring out at the rain. Geoffrey nursed a whisky. Clarissa sat apart, knitting. Miss Marple took her usual chair and began her own knitting, the needles clicking softly. At 4 o'clock tea was brought in. As Thomas poured with trembling hand, Miss Marple spoke conversationally. "Such a pity the weather has turned. I had hoped to see the rose garden properly." "Clarissa, dear, you know the summer house well, I think?" Clarissa looked up, startled. Diana's needle stabbed her finger. She gave a little exclamation. Blake turned sharply from the window. "The summer house?" he repeated. "Why mention that, Miss Marple?" "Oh, only because I walked there this morning. Such a charming spot, though rather damp just now. I noticed the floor wants repairing. One board quite loose." Diana went very white. Blake's dark face became a mask. Inspector Slack entered at that moment, shaking rain from his hat. "Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A word, if you please. Mr. Wilkins is stronger and has recalled something important. He says the person he argued with on the stairs was wearing a distinctive perfume, jasmine and sandalwood, I think he said, rather unusual." Diana rose abruptly. "I have a headache. Please excuse me." She left the room. Blake followed a moment later, murmuring about fetching a book. Miss Marple continued knitting, her mild blue eyes thoughtful. The net was drawing tighter. The emerald was found, the letters identified, the footprints and cigarette stub noted. And now the mention of perfume. Diana's favourite, expensive and unmistakable. Blake would try to retrieve the brooch tonight, Miss Marple felt certain. Or Diana would send him. Either way, the conspiracy was cracking. She glanced at Clarissa. The girl met her eyes and gave a tiny nod. Relief and trust mingled. Outside, the rain eased to a gentle drizzle. Dusk gathered early under the low clouds. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly. Soon, she thought, it would be time for the final gathering, under the Christmas tree perhaps, where so many small clues had waited patiently for someone to notice them. Human nature, after all, was seldom subtle when panic set in. Chapter 7. The Butler's Breaking Point. The evening of the 27th of December settled over Harrington Hall with a heavy, expectant quiet. The rain had stopped at last, leaving the air raw and cold. A thin mist rose from the sodden lawns, curling around the stone balustrades like smoke. Inside, fires were lit early, but they did little to dispel the chill that had nothing to do with weather. Inspector Slack had departed for the day, promising to return at 9 the next morning with a search warrant if necessary. He had taken away the brass screw Miss Marple quietly handed him, along with a careful note of the cigarette stub and the footprints. His manner had been grudgingly respectful. He sensed that the old lady from St. Mary Mead knew more than she had yet told him. Dinner was served at 8, but it was a shadow of former meals. Only 6 sat down. Lady Harrington, Richard, Colonel Bantry, Geoffrey, Clarissa, and Miss Marple. Diana had sent word that her headache was worse. Mr. Blake pleaded a touch of neuralgia and took a tray in his room. No one commented on the absences, but the empty chairs spoke loudly. Wilkins, against doctor's orders, had insisted on leaving his bed. Pale and shaken, his arm in a sling and a plaster on his forehead, he stood behind Lady Harrington's chair, directing the nervous Thomas with curt nods. His eyes, usually so expressionless, darted continually towards the door. Miss Marple watched him with quiet compassion. She knew the signs. The man was at the end of his tether. After dinner, the diminished party gathered in the drawing-room. Coffee was served, brandy circulated, conversation was fitful. Geoffrey drank steadily. Clarissa sat close to her grandmother, holding the old lady's hand as though for comfort. Richard stared into the fire, his face drawn. At 10 o'clock Wilkins entered with a fresh log basket. As he bent to place it by the hearth, Mr. Blake appeared in the doorway, coat on, hat in hand. "Forgive me," Blake said smoothly, "but the neuralgia is better. I think a breath of night air will do me good. I may walk down to the summer house, clear my head." Lady Harrington inclined her head. "As you wish, Mr. Blake." Blake's dark eyes flicked once toward Wilkins, then away. He left by the French windows, closing them softly behind him. Wilkins straightened slowly. His face was ashen. Miss Marple laid down her knitting. "Mr. Wilkins," she said gently, "I think the time has come for plain speaking. You have carried a heavy burden these past days. Would it not be easier to share it?" The butler stood rigid. For a long moment no one moved. Then his shoulders sagged. I cannot, miss. It is not my place." "Your place," Miss Marple said, "is to serve this family faithfully. And the greatest service you can render now is the truth. You know where the emerald brooch has been hidden, do you not?" Lady Harrington drew a sharp breath. Richard half rose from his chair. Wilkins looked wildly about him, like an animal seeking escape. Then, suddenly, the mask of decades cracked. "It was Mrs. Diana," he burst out, his voice hoarse. "I saw her take it, Christmas morning before church. She had a key, copied from her ladyship's, I don't know how. I was passing the sitting-room door on my way down from the attics, and it was ajar. She came out in a hurry, something wrapped in a scarf. She didn't see me." "Why did you not speak at once?" Richard demanded. Wilkins's mouth worked. Because she threatened me, sir. Later that morning, when the loss was discovered, she came to my pantry. Said if I spoke, she would tell everyone about my past. The trouble at Lord Carver's, the missing silver that was never proved against me. She'd found out somehow, said she'd ruin me, that no house would ever employ me again. He passed a trembling hand over his brow. And there was more. She knew about the old grudge, my father and Sir Gerald. She said she'd make sure her ladyship believed I'd taken the brooch myself, out of revenge after all these years. I was afraid. 23 years of faithful service, and it would all count for nothing. Lady Harrington's face was very pale, but her voice was steady. "Go on, Wilkins." That evening, after dinner, I saw her pass something to Mr. Blake by the Christmas tree, when everyone was singing carols, wrapped in a handkerchief. Later, I followed Blake to the terrace doors. He went out into the dark, toward the summer house. I guessed what they planned. Richard strode to the bell and rang violently. "We must stop Blake!" But Miss Marple raised a quiet hand. "Colonel Bantry is watching the summer house, at my suggestion. Mr. Blake will not get far." Wilkins continued, the words pouring out now like water from a broken dam. "Yesterday, when I fell, or was pushed, I had confronted Mrs. Diana on the back stairs. I told her I would speak to her ladyship that night, no matter what. She laughed at first, then grew angry. She said I'd regret it. Next thing I knew, something caught my foot. The rod was loose, and I was falling." He looked at Richard with desperate appeal. "I swear I never meant harm to the family, sir. I only kept silent out of fear. But when I heard Miss Marple speak of the loose board in the summer house just now, I knew Blake was going for the brooch tonight, to take it away tomorrow. I couldn't let it happen." Clarissa began to cry softly. Lady Harrington put an arm around her. At that moment, the French windows opened again. Colonel Bantry entered, triumphant, propelling a dishevelled Mr. Blake before him. Blake's coat was muddy, his elegant hair awry, and in his hand he clutched the chamois leather bag. "Caught him red-handed," the colonel boomed. tried to run for it across the rose garden, but slipped in the mud. I sat on him till he saw sense." Blake glared about him, but the fight had gone out of him. Richard took the bag, opened it, and drew out the emerald brooch. It flashed green fire in the lamplight. Lady Harrington rose. "Thank you, Colonel, and thank you, Wilkins, for your courage at last." The butler bowed his head, tears glinting in his eyes. Miss Marple spoke quietly. "There is one more matter. Mrs. Diana Harrington has in her possession certain letters belonging to Miss Clarissa, letters that have been used for blackmail. They must be recovered, and the whole sorry story laid before Inspector Slack tomorrow." Richard's face was grim. "I will deal with my wife." He left the room, his footsteps echoing up the stairs. A few minutes later, Diana appeared, white-faced, flanked by her husband. She did not speak, but handed over the bundle of letters without meeting anyone's eyes. Blake was taken to the library to await the police. Diana was escorted to her room, under guard, though no one said it aloud. Wilkins, utterly spent, was helped below stairs by Thomas and Mrs. Hardcastle. The remaining members of the household sat in silence for a long time, watching the fire burn low. At length, Lady Harrington spoke, her voice steady but weary. "This has been a sorrowful Christmas, but truth, however painful, is better than deceit. Jane, I do not know how to thank you." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I did very little. People reveal themselves in the end, if one only watches and waits." Clarissa whispered, "Will everything be all right now?" "In time, my dear," Miss Marple said. "Scars heal, and you have a loving family who will stand by you when all is known." Outside, the mist thickened, wrapping the old house in soft obscurity. Inside, the Christmas tree stood dark and silent, its decorations drooping a little now that the season was nearly spent. But somewhere in the servants' quarters, Wilkins, shattered yet strangely relieved, slept at last without fear. And upstairs, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom fire a little longer, knitting steadily. One more gathering remained, she thought. Tomorrow, when Inspector Slack arrived, she would explain everything clearly and kindly, under the Christmas tree, where the first small clues had waited so patiently. Human nature had played its familiar drama: greed, fear, desperation, and finally the breaking point. But goodness, too, had prevailed. Chapter 8. Resolution under the Mistletoe. The morning of the 28th of December arrived crisp and sunny, the low winter light slanting through the tall windows of Harrington Hall, and striking golden sparks from the crystal drops on the chandelier. The mist had lifted overnight, revealing a world washed clean. The slush was freezing into glittering crusts, and every twig on the bare rose bushes sparkled with ice. Inspector Slack arrived promptly at 9, accompanied by a sergeant and a photographer. He found the household already assembled in the great hall, gathered beneath the Christmas tree as Miss Marple had quietly suggested the night before. The tree, though its candles were gone, and its needles beginning to drop, still lent a certain festive solemnity to the scene. Lady Harrington sat in a high-backed chair, straight and composed, the recovered emerald brooch pinned at her throat where it belonged. Richard stood beside her, grim-faced but steady. Clarissa, pale but calmer than she had been for weeks, sat close to her grandmother. Colonel Bantry and Geoffrey occupied armchairs to one side. Wilkins, his arm still in a sling, but otherwise recovered, stood respectfully at the back with Mrs. Hardcastle and the upper servants. Diana Harrington and Mr. Blake were present under restraint. Diana pale and silent in a plain grey dress, Blake sullen, his usual polish quite gone. They sat apart, watched discreetly by the sergeant. Miss Marple, small and neat in her grey woolen dress, stood near the tree. A sprig of mistletoe still hung from the chandelier above her head, a forgotten remnant of Christmas merriment. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "With your permission, your ladyship, Miss Marple, has asked to explain the sequence of events before we proceed with formal statements." Lady Harrington inclined her head. "Please, Jane." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle, but carrying clearly in the hushed hall. It began, as these things so often do, with money, or the lack of it. Mrs. Diana Harrington had accumulated substantial debts through extravagance in London. Her husband, quite properly, had restricted her allowance. She needed a large sum quickly and quietly. The Harrington emerald, though much loved, was insured and not often worn. Its disappearance would cause distress, but could be explained away. Mr. Blake, an acquaintance with connections in the less reputable side of the antiques trade, offered a solution: steal the brooch, sell it abroad, and divide the proceeds. They planned it carefully. Diana had a duplicate key made from Lady Harrington's chatelaine, while it lay on her dressing table one afternoon. On Christmas morning, while the household was preparing for church, she entered the sitting room and took the brooch from its case. She wiped away fingerprints, she's a great reader of detective novels, and wrapped the brooch in a silk handkerchief. Later, during the gathering round the tree, she passed it to Mr. Blake, who concealed it in his pocket. That night, under cover of darkness, he carried it to the old summer house and hid it beneath the loose floorboard, a hiding place known to the family from earlier generations. But there was an unforeseen complication. Miss Clarissa, burdened by her own secret troubles, had been drawn into the scheme. Diana had discovered Clarissa's correspondence with a certain gentleman in London, and threatened exposure unless Clarissa agreed to take the blame if necessary. Clarissa was to have entered the sitting room that same morning and discovered the loss, thus providing Diana with an alibi. Fortunately, Clarissa could not bring herself to do it. She went to the room intending to confess everything to her grandmother, but found the brooch already gone. Mr. Wilkins, passing the sitting-room door earlier, had seen Diana emerge in haste. He said nothing at first, partly from fear. Diana later threatened to revive old rumours about missing silver in his previous employment, and to suggest that his family's ancient grudge against Sir Gerald gave him motive. On the evening after the theft was discovered, Wilkins found courage to confront Diana on the back stairs. She loosened a stair rod earlier that day, intending perhaps only to warn him, or worse. In the struggle, Wilkins caught his foot and fell, striking his head. Yesterday, when pressure mounted and Mr. Blake prepared to retrieve the brooch for flight, Wilkins could bear the silence no longer. His confession last night led Colonel Bantry to intercept Blake in the summer house, and the brooch was recovered. Miss Marple paused, looking round the silent circle. There are, of course, mitigating circumstances. Miss Clarissa's difficulties arose from youth and misplaced trust. She has suffered greatly and has now placed her confidence where it belongs, in her family. The letters used to coerce her have been returned and will be destroyed. Mrs. Diana Harrington and Mr. Blake must answer to the law for theft and conspiracy. The attempt on Wilkins's life, whether deliberate or panicked, will be for the courts to decide. But here, under this Christmas tree where so many small clues waited patiently, a green silk thread a brass screw, a forgotten cigarette stub, we may draw a line. Justice has been served, and mercy may yet have its place. She stepped back. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Lady Harrington rose. The emerald flashed at her throat as she moved. "Thank you, Jane," she said simply. "You have given us back more than a jewel. You have given us truth, and with it, the chance to heal." She turned to Wilkins. "You have served this family for 23 years, often under difficult circumstances. Your silence was wrong, but your final courage was right. You will remain in my service as long as you wish." Wilkins bowed, tears in his eyes once more. "Thank you, my lady." Richard spoke next, his voice rough. "Diana, the rest we will settle privately and legally, but you will leave this house today." Diana rose without a word and left the hall, head high but shoulders shaking. Blake was led away by the sergeant to the waiting car. Inspector Slack, who had listened with growing respect, now took charge. Statements were given, photographs taken, the brooch formally returned to Lady Harrington. By noon the police had gone, taking the conspirators with them. The depleted household lunched quietly. Afterward, Clarissa sought out Miss Marple in the conservatory. "I telephoned the adoption agency this morning," she said shyly. "They will arrange for me to receive news of the baby, photographs, perhaps even visits one day. Grandmother says she will help, whatever I decide." Miss Marple smiled. "That is good news indeed, my dear. A child should know it is loved." In the afternoon the sun strengthened, turning the ice to diamonds. Richard and the Colonel walked the estate, discussing repairs and new drainage. Geoffrey, sobered by events, announced his intention to return to London and settle his own debts honestly. Lady Harrington wrote letters at last at her bureau, the emerald safe once more in its case. As evening drew in, Miss Marple stood alone in the great hall. The tree would be taken down tomorrow, but tonight a few candles had been relit in the chandelier, and the mistletoe still hung overhead. Wilkins approached, carrying a small silver tray with 2 glasses of sherry. "With her ladyship's compliments, miss, and my own profound thanks." Miss Marple accepted a glass. "You have nothing to thank me for, Mr. Wilkins. You found your own courage in the end." They drank in companionable silence, watching the candle flames reflected in the ornaments. Outside, the frozen gardens lay peaceful under starlight. Inside, the old house seemed to breathe more easily, as though a long-held shadow had lifted. Miss Marple set down her glass. "Christmas," she said softly, "is a time for truth and for forgiveness. Both have been granted here, I think." Wilkins inclined his head. "Yes, miss, a happy ending after all." "Not an ending," Miss Marple corrected gently, looking up at the mistletoe. "A beginning." She left the hall, her footsteps light on the marble. Upstairs, she packed her small suitcase, for the London train would call tomorrow. In St. Faubourg Mary Mead, there would be village gossip to catch up on, knitting to finish, and perhaps another invitation before long. But tonight, under the mistletoe at Harrington Hall, justice and mercy had met, and an old house and the people in it had been given back their peace. Miss Marple smiled as she turned off her bedside lamp. Human nature, she reflected, was very strange and very wonderful, especially at Christmas.